Hey guys, Loma02. I'm going to be doing a video deck tech and recording of a League game set of with this vintage deck that you have in front of you, which is blue-white, red, minor red, control, or Jeskai Control. The deck is heavily biased to beat Paradoxical Outcome, so I have been on a brash recently of playing vintage leagues. I managed to break even on all of them. However, this is the deck that I felt was probably the most neutral bias deck. I wouldn't say the best in the format, I think that title probably belongs to some build of Paradoxical Outcome right now, likely the Esper builds. Although all those decks kind of have a target on their heads, so they're being meted very heavily against, sort of like what this deck is doing. This is the deck that I felt the most comfortable, I think, playing, as far as, like, if I lost, I tended to, know why I lost, or it was just a bad matchup, or it had some cards that were problem cards I didn't really have good sideboarding material for. But in general, the deck offered a lot of decision-making, which I think, enabled me to have a pretty decent run with it. I ended up going 4-1 to spoil myself. Anyways, let's jump into the deck. So the deck is a vintage control deck, so, despite it only having 20 mana sources, plus a mana drain, I suppose, for 21 light. This is a pretty landed deck. 20 mana sources is a decent bit in a 60 card deck for vintage because it tends to rely on Comer-esque philosophy that each cantrip can allow you to, or each two cantrips can allow you to play one less land. So essentially, when you start looking at all the preordains, the Brainstorm, the Ponder, the Gitaxian Probe, the Search for Iskanta, the Ancestral Recall, etc., the Dak Fadens, the Jaces, the Tefiris, the deck is going to operate more like it's a 26 to 30 land deck, probably even more than that. Generally speaking, land's not going to be a resource that you're constrained on, but it does happen from time to time. Anyways, not a lot of artifact mana, so this deck is not fast to kill. It does not have any good fast combo kills. I suppose Monastery Mentor would be the closest thing that you have to that, so you really can't close the game fast. So it is just a big blue control deck that utilizes Force of Will and then a litany of blue control cards and cantrips to kind of manipulate the deck to get the answers that it needs in the time frame it needs them. So look at the first pile of all my cantrips and one-drops. We have Gitaxian Probe, which is pretty ubiquitous with blue decks. 4 of Mental Misstep. I think Mental Misstep's in a fine position right now, and it's not bad to have them in the deck because they're a good card to sideboard out for against stacks or Mishra's Workshop-based decks. As you can see, I'm highlighting over here the 9 cards that come in to support that matchup. Actually, I'm sorry, the 8 cards that come in to support that matchup. But Mental Misstep's fine against Dark Petition Storm. I think it definitely shines there. It's not horrendous against Paradoxical Outcome, but it's generally not as good against that deck because the deck relies on less one-drops. It's not a ritual-based deck. Ancestral Recall, of course. Brainstorm. The restricted cards I'll probably skip over mentioning because they're not that interesting. 2 Flusterstorms, definitely kind of interesting. This deck is sideboarded, or is main-decked, hot-tacked, if you will, very heavily to beat up on Paradoxical Outcome decks. I found the matchups I was losing with my other decks that I played, which I have not played a Paradoxical Outcome deck in League yet, tended to be Paradoxical Outcome decks. I didn't tend to lose to many other things. So I felt like, that deck seemed pretty good. Like, the 5 or 6 playthroughs I've done in the Vintage League, it's generally felt like that deck's probably tier 0.75, and, like, the rest of the pillars are kind of like hovering around 1 in their best builds. 4 preordains, so just a good deck manipulation. This also does run 2 lightning bolts. You kind of do need answers to Monastery Mentors on the opposite side, and also to Leovul, which is a card that you'll see was a little problematic for my list. I have 2 Pyroblasts as well, so just main decked to fight Paradoxical Outcome Storm again, and then it's also just decent in the mirror. 1 Stony Silence. We only have 4 artifact sources of mana. One of them is kind of just, use it and lose it. So Stony Silence tends to be very strong in this deck, and it tends to completely shut down the artifact-based strategies like Angel City Vault, right now Paradoxical Outcome. Even aggro shops to a large extent can be shut off by this card. Merchant Scroll tends to find Ancestral Recall, but I also used it in the League to find Force of Will if I really needed to have a counter on a certain turn. Search for Iskanta, just good in the mirrors. I'm not sure if it deserves its place here, but it is kind of a spicy one, and the card is a pretty, can be a pretty heavy earner in the long game. I think, typically speaking, you're going to rather have Loa as opposed to Search, but Search is still fine. 3 Snapcaster Mages just to recur value. Oftentimes they're just going to be recasting Mental Missteps, Pyroblast. Sometimes they'll be spicy and get an Ancestral, but typically just 1 mana spells. Time Walk, we have a Mentor in this deck. We have some Snapcasters. We also have 5 Planeswalkers. So Time Walk's fine. I would say it's medium in this list. It's definitely better in this list than it is in, like, Paradoxical Outcome Storm, for instance, or, Dark Petition Storm. Mana Drain. There are certain cards that you hit this thing with, and the game is just over because you go into your turn and play out a Teferi or a Jace the Mind Sculptor with Counterspell backup, and, that's just that. Stony Silence, like we said, a lot of artifact-based decks right now that are running around, and this just tends to shut them off completely. Dak Vaden, also a good hedge against that, also good against workshops, also just good in our own deck because it helps filter, and we can get to lands if we need them, or we can get to spells. We can set up Delve for Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time, our 2 other broken restricted blue cards. It's just pretty solid. Monastery Mentor, just another way to win with the deck. Monastery Mentor is still broken. I believe I won 1 or 2 games with it. Really didn't win them. My opponent conceded before I could win them. Fire Ice, this is an interesting card in the deck. I'm not really sure if I'm sold on it, but this is not my list. I ended up stealing this one. But Fire Ice is fine. I mean, it can tap a permanent randomly, which can be good against like the shops list if you need to tap a shop just to gain some value, or tap a Trinisphere, whatever. It can do a couple things against them. The fire side of it's not bad against like the Pyromancer decks. It can also kill a Monastery Mentor, be the third way to kill a Monastery Mentor outside of Lightning Bolt. 2 Jace, the Mind Sculptor. This is ostensibly the way the deck wins. Typically speaking, it just wins the Jace, just card advantage. It eventually just kills them with the top feature of Jace. Teferi can also win the game. I had this guy resolve once, but the game never really came to a fruitful conclusion because my opponent just packed it in. 4 Force of Will. This is a big blue deck, and it needs to run Force of Will to be competitive in the format. Gush, just decent card draw, combos well with Monastery Mentor. Also combos very well with Dak Vaden, as you can get in the late game and not need all the lands you have, and be very happy to get rid of them. And the 2 Delve cards to just get into more gas in the mid to late game. As far as sideboarding goes, we have 8 slots committed to the stack/workshop matchup. We have 1 Pyroblast to bolster the mirror match, and also to, if we face off against Paradoxical Outcome Storm. And then we have 6 hate cards, 3 Containment Priest, and 3 Ravenous Trap for the Dredge matchup. So that is the deck, guys. It's a deck I stole, and actually had a really good time playing, and I'm going to highlight the games that we played in a 5-game match set in a vintage league on MTGO. I'll be right back with Game 1. Alright guys, this hand is perfectly acceptable, and I keep it on the draw. With Library of Alexandria, against anything blue, I'm going to be in good shape. But I see a Bazaar of Baghdad and have to swallow sadness. There's no way I can beat Dredge pre-boarded. I don't think there's any way. There's no combo in the deck, like there's not a Tinker or anything like that in the deck, so I can't win right off. Opponent also has a very strong Dredge and gets down a couple Narcomoebas, has Prized Amalgams coming, and also has Bloodghast. I go ahead and pack it in here. I was kind of just I could have conceded before this, but I was kind of on a fact-finding mission to see if my opponent was playing Force of Will. We know at a minimum they're playing Mental Misstep, but I want to prevent them from using their Cabal Therapy here because I really don't want them to see my hand and just get more information. So when the triggers hit for these Bloodghast, as opposed to allowing them to cast their Cabal Therapy, I just go ahead and pack it in because I could be on a wider variety of decks off of Library of Alexandria. Most arrows point to some sort of big blue control, but it could be Dark Petition Storm or Paradoxical Outcome Storm as well. So we lose Game 1 quite handily against Dredge, but we kind of expect that. This deck is not good versus Dredge pre-sideboard. There's really absolutely no way it can win unless they mulligan to 0. Alright guys, quick break, and we'll be right back for Game 2 against Dredge. Alright guys, back. First hand is keepable. This is an acceptable hand because we have Ravenous Trap to kind of hose them. Although the hand really doesn't do that much. I put Force of Will on the bottom and keep the Ravenous Trap. Right now I'm kind of just looking for like 1 more hate piece. Generally 3 hate pieces is enough to put Dredge to bed. They go ahead and Bazaar here, of course. And have a Light from the Loam. Light from the Loam variety of this deck has actually been a lot more popular. I do go ahead and just snap this off right now. I don't really want them to get a creature down with a bridge in their yard and a Cabal Therapy in their yard. I feel like I lose more games if I allow that to happen. Draw very well for the turn, get my 3rd hate piece, and say go. And at this point, I don't think there's any way my opponent can win. They would have to have numerous Force of Wills, but they're going to be discarding very heavily. And it's going to be unlikely that they're able to keep that many Force of Wills or counterspells in hand to stop me. They go ahead and Bazaar again, hit more Narcomoebas, but at this point I go ahead and just Ravenous Trap them for a bazillion cards. They have exactly one Bridge left in their deck, one Bloodghast, and one Prized Amalgam that can come into play. Otherwise, everything else has been exiled at this point. So they go ahead and pack it in on 13 cards. It's not likely they're going to be able to get enough Dredge to actually make a relevant difference and kill me with it. So we'll go on to Game 3 here momentarily. Alright guys, so this is Game 3 versus Dredge with Jeskai Control. This hand is speculative. Against Dredge, they're on the play, and I have no hate pieces. But I do have an Ancestral Recall, and if that resolves, it's pretty likely that I'll be able to find myself some answers. So I go ahead and keep this, despite it being very risky. I think it's better than going to 6, to be honest, though. It's essentially a 9-card hand. Is how I think I need to look at it. Hollowed One happens, I see a Force of Will, and I'm like, oh, Force of Will, why? I'm able to put both the cards that I see to the bottom, find a Ravenous Trap, which is at least going to keep me out of trouble with their graveyard as long as I don't get overrun by Hollowed Ones, but I do also have a Dak Faden. So, one of the things I did here is I discarded a Dak Faden, which probably leads them to believe that I have another one. That's why they Cabal Therapy here. I go ahead and counter the Cabal Therapy, leaving them with 1/2/2 zombie, find a Mox Pearl, go ahead and play out a Preordain here, finding a Snapcaster for the Ancestral Recall, get more cards, back up to 7 with numerous counter spells. They go ahead and Dredge here. I go ahead and Ravenous Trap, getting rid of their Icarid and cards in graveyard, but they're down to 1 card in hand, and I know for a fact it's not a Dredge card. I go ahead and Gush here, because I'm planning on playing Dak. I want to get rid of some of these lands. I get rid of one of the fetches and a Volcanic, and I actually ditch the Library of Alexandria, because I think my mana is going to be busy over the next couple of turns. One of the problems I could run into with this hand, though, is that right now it does not stop the graveyard. Although I'm seeing a lot of cards, I managed to just find a strip mine away their land, and now have Containment Priest and numerous Force of Wills available. I play out the Containment Priest with them on 1 land, draw into some more cards, get rid of the fetch because I'm very rapidly going through my library, and it's not likely that I'll be able to. It's not likely that for forever I'll be able to find lands with those fetches, and why take the extra damage, right? So I go ahead and fire their zombie token, making a 1/1 monk token, and with them on 2 cards and me at numerous Force of Wills, they just go ahead and pack it in. Not very likely they can win. They have to kill the Containment Priest to really get back in the game. Find a Bazaar off the top. It's not very likely they can get back into this. So they go ahead and pack it in, and we managed to take Game 1 in this 5-game set in the league against Dredge with blue-white splash red control. Be right back, guys, for Game 2. Alright guys, back. This recording unfortunately was broke before. Hopefully it'll work this time. This hand is acceptable. It's not great if I'm against blue, but it's not bad against stacks. I go ahead Ancestral here. Get countered by Mental Misstep, which is okay, but I don't think it gets better if I sit on it. They have an Ancestral of their own, which is Savage. I draw into a Snapcaster, which is fine. They draw a card here off of their Library of Alexandria. I find a Tundra, say go, tap down their library. Well, they're on 8 cards. They go ahead and Ponder here, looking for who knows what, probably Counter Magic. I find Strip Mine, but I'm so far behind at this point that I actually just opt to force them to force me. So they cast their Force of Will here, and I get them down to 6 cards. They have an Ice. I go ahead and tap in response to Ice. And they have a Pyroblast as well, which kind of stinks because I was hoping to get an Ancestral Recall off of that. I play out a Strip Mine. Because I'm so far behind, I just go ahead and Strip Mine their colored source, hoping that I can possibly take them off of colored mana for Dak Faden. They have another source, though. They go ahead and loot here and put a Graveyard or a Lightning Bolt and a Mental Misstep in the yard. I go ahead and fetch off of a land I found, try to dig through time, assuming that I'll probably get countered here. I get very lucky, and my opponent probably miscounts here. They Flusterstorm for 2, which I pay for, which is nice. I mean, that's an error that could possibly turn this game. I go ahead and take a Force of Will and a Mental Misstep here because I'm just looking to resolve the Teferi. Opponent Gitaxian Probe, seeing my hand, goes ahead and gushes here, making mana. Resolves a Search for his Kanta, which is going to flip next turn. Digs, finds Ruby plus Jace the Mind Sculptor. I attempt to Force of Will here. They Force of Will back, and I do resolve my Teferi on the next turn, but lose the game. So this replay is broken. I did attempt to force that. They force back. I resolve Teferi. they eventually win the game. I forget how they destroy the Teferi, but they do something to it. Plus, they have 2 Planeswalkers. We just lose horrifically in Game 1. So, boarding plan, pretty simple. Bring in Pyroblast, and that's it. But we'll go to Game 2 here momentarily. Guys, back. This hand is acceptable. It's nothing special, but it's also not horrendous either. I go ahead and Merchant Scroll here. Pretty easy. Find the Ancestral. Just force them to leave up Mental Missteps here. They go ahead and Ponder. I go ahead and Mental Misstep their Ponder. I know that's kind of greedy, but my thinking was I had Snapcaster available. I go ahead and Mental Misstep their Mental Misstep. They have another Mental Misstep, and all of the missteps have been cast. I could have left up the Snapcaster here to counter the last Mental Misstep, but I actually didn't do that because I wanted to just resolve it later. They go ahead and Brainstorm here, and then I Mental Misstep their Ancestral, putting them down to 3 cards with a draw step. But the good news is this actually does not resolve, which means my opponent's likely out of counter magic. I think they force there if they have it. And I get the turn back and find the land, getting fairly lucky, and play out the Jace the Mind Sculptor. Look at their top card because they are running Lightning Bolts, and I would prefer not to get my Jace bolted. Now, if they have Pyroblast, I'll just lose there. Very happy to pick up a Dak Fade and have a Pyroblast to protect it. They go ahead and try to Mana Drain it. I go ahead and Pyroblast the Mana Drain. They have Flusterstorm as their second to last card, and then they go ahead and take the turn back after I attack for 2, putting them down to 10. So, we're at an interesting point in the game here. I think I've kind of got them out of gas. Unfortunately, I'm also quite out of gas. I believe they play a Jace here, which is kind of rough, and have a Fire to kill my Snapcaster. They dig for cards. I go ahead and get lucky and draw a Treasure Cruise here. Go ahead and draw a bunch of cards, hoping to find a Snapcaster. Don't find a Snapcaster, but find a Bolt. They have Mental Misstep as their last card. I Mana Drain the Mental Misstep to get 1 mana on my second main phase, so I probably should have waited on that. They have a Containment Priest on top. I actually bottom that because I don't want to have to deal with the thing, because dealing with creatures, I already used one of my ways of dealing with creatures. I only have 2 left in the deck, so I just get rid of it because it's kind of a problematic card against Jace. They evidently top deck into nothing, and we have the game pretty well locked up, so we go on to Game 3 here. Be back momentarily for Game 3, guys. Alright, guys, back. This hand's great against another blue deck. We have Library of Alexandria, which, tends to win games. Neither of our decks is designed to win fast. I think we may be in the exact mirror. We could actually almost probably have exact 75 mirrors of each other. They appear to be playing the same deck I am. I go ahead and just Loa here, draw to another land. My hand's not phenomenal, but it has some game to it. I put out a Flooded Strand and figure I'm going to be discarding on end step here. But they do me a big favor and actually try to fight me on my end step, which is great for me because I'm actually going to be discarding anyways. So I go ahead and fetch, find a Volcanic Island here, Pyroblast their Ice. They go ahead and Mental Misstep. I draw in response, find an Opal, counter the counter. I'm really just doing this to stop them from drawing a card, put them down to 4 cards essentially in hand. The worst thing that could happen here is they resolve a Jace the Mind Sculptor. What they do instead is resolve a Monastery Mentor. I go ahead and fetch, draw, find a Snapcaster, play out Ruby. I go ahead and bolt this. They have Force of Will in hand, making a token. And it's possible that I wanted to play out the Pearl first, so I could have Snapcaster for Mental Misstep. But this works out just as well. If their last card is Mental Misstep, then I just get completely owned there, and I probably lose the game. But I didn't think it was very likely that they had it, because they probably would have used it before they use Force of Will on a card. Unless they were really next leveling me. I'd blow up their white Mana Source just to keep them back on tempo. They go ahead and play out Dak Faden here, if I'm not mistaken, which I have to accept. They take my white source of mana. I go ahead and draw into a Teferi. I fetch for a white source, Tundra. Play out the Jace the Mind Sculptor, leaving open Pyroblast. Instead, I find Snapcaster and Black Lotus, which allows me to get my other Pyroblast back from the yard. They're at 0 cards, so this is going to resolve. Kill off the Dak Faden, because I don't want them looting to find better cards. I want them basically off their top deck. I just go ahead and Mental Misstep this to buy more time. Draw to Teferi. I top deck them with my Jace, see a land, and I'm very happy with that. Play out Teferi, draw, attack. And the game is pretty much over at this point. Teferi, my 2 Planeswalkers essentially end the game, much like their 2 Planeswalkers did in Game 1. I saw an Ancestral on top of their deck. I go ahead and bottom that. I'd rather them have most things other than that. Untap both of my lands here and say go. They preordain. I allow this preordain to happen. They play a land out and say go to me. I assume they probably have counters or counterspell of some sort at this time. I go ahead and draw here, find Brainstorm, go ahead and chase them, see Loa, leave Loa on top. I go ahead and use Ponder, find a Time Walk, cast a Time Walk, and my opponent packs it in here. So that is the end of Game 2, currently 2-0 up in the league at this point. Quick break, guys. We'll be back for Game 3. Alright guys, back, and I believe this is our first true Paradoxical Outcome matchup. This hand is acceptable, but it's a little risky. It obviously has its risk. My opponent mulliganed heavily, though, and I was glad to keep this hand. My preordain, hoping to find what I found there as opposed to having to Merchant Scroll for the Ancestral, I find it, draw a bazillion cards, and resolve a Dak Faden. Opponent resolves a Mox Sapphire. I allow this to resolve. They see nothing worthwhile on top, bottom both, and then draw into some nonsense that doesn't really change the game state. And they go ahead and pack it in. We win this one quite spectacularly because our opponent mulliganed very heavily on a combo deck that requires a lot of cards for its combination to work out right. Be right back momentarily, guys, for Game 2 in this match. Alright, guys, back. Game 2. This hand is dicey. I brought in 2x-Forces in this matchup and a Pyroblast. I don't really want 2x-Forces, but what can you do? I allow this to resolve, which could have been a mistake. But I don't think I can spend my resources willy-nilly in this hand. I get a look at their hand here with Gitaxian Probe. See that they basically have a Tutor and not much else going on. They do have a Pyroblast or Red Elemental Blast as well, though, which means that I'm going to have to double counter whatever I counter with my Force of Will. They go ahead and Demonic Tutor here, find Yawgmoth's Will. I could have countered that, but I think I need them to make a mistake here. They have way too many cards for me to, I think, really win on just trying to force them. Now we know they have Force of Will in hand. They go ahead and try to go for a Paradoxical Outcome. I attempt to counter it. They Force of Will my Pyroblast. I go ahead and ice one of their permanents, just trying to look for an additional Pyroblast. I do not find it. They win the counter fight. I go ahead and just pack it in there. I'm like, yeah, I'm probably dead. There are 35 cards. They have 7 in hand. If they don't have it, I mean, what am I doing on my next turn? I'm just, there's nothing I can really draw that's going to change what this game state looks like here. So I go ahead and just pack it in. And on to the next one, guys. Back. That first hand was unacceptable. It did have the best card in the matchup against my opponent in Stony Silence, but it had no lands. So I play out 2 cards here. I feel like Mana Drain on the play is pretty sweet. I know my top card. That's why I didn't fetch with my Flooded Strand. It's a Dak Faden, so that's also why I allow the Soul Ring to resolve because I'm going to steal it. I get 2 mana off of this because I countered their defense grid, play out a Dak Faden, steal the Soul Ring, and I actually Merchant Scroll for Force of Will here, because if they have just a boatload of artifact mana and a Paradoxical Outcome, that's the way they win this game. They go ahead and Brainstorm here, probably looking for a way to try to turn the game this very turn, but they know I have Force. They do cast a Paradoxical Outcome, which is pretty much exactly Ancestral Recall. I go ahead and get it and draw into a pretty decent one. Chase the Mind Sculptor's never been called horrendous. Play on a Jace here, find Flusterstorm, Force of Will, and the best card in my deck in this matchup, Stony Silence. They play out a Sensei's Divoting Top. I still have Flusterstorm up, though, which is bound to get a Paradoxical Outcome if they try casting it on that turn. Draw into Force here. I go ahead and actually draw first with Jace, which is kind of a rare instance because I don't want to discard any of the 3 cards that I have on top of my deck that I know about. Like, the other 2 cards are assuredly going to be discarded. Because I want the Force, I want the Fluster, and I want the Stony Silence. There's nothing else that I would rather have than those left in my deck. Maybe I would discard Force of Will for like an Ancestral Recall, but I didn't want to discard any one of those 3, which I would have had to if I had used Dak there. So I think that was actually correct. Anyways, so we end up taking this one down. Quick pause, guys. We'll come back for game number 4 in this league. Alright guys, back. This hand is perfectly acceptable. It has a Force of Will, it has a Gitaxian Probe. They're going to Gitaxian Probe me. Play on a Mox, plus I believe a Flooded Strand. Possibly in the mirror, possibly against Paradoxical Outcome. Hard to tell. Draw to a Mox Pearl of my own, which means that Jace could be coming down on a faster timeline. Based on what we saw in their hand, their deck is kind of a weird, like, Esper bug. Like, it's like Esper, like, splash green. deck. They have Tasigur in hand and Dig Through Time. We get them to burn off their Flusterstorm there, which I'm happy to do. We know they have Fetch Land plus Brainstorm, so we allow that to happen. They do play out a Mox Jet, which I'm fine seeing here. They attempt to resolve a DAC. We counter the DAC, pitching the Brainstorm. Draw into pretty much a perfect here. One of our pieces of fast mana that we have available in the deck. Play out the Jace, the Mind Sculptor. Draw, find, also again, very, very good cards. Force of Will and Preordained to counter the Dig Through Time that they're likely to try to resolve here. They give it a whirl. And now we know their hand is pretty much exactly Tasigur plus X. I'll go ahead and draw, find Ancestral here, and they just go ahead and concede it. So quick break, guys, and we'll be back for games 2. Or for games back. This hand is acceptable. It needs to hit mana, though. Opponent plays out an Underground Sea. Draw into a Delve card that we don't really want right now. Hand has Flusterstorm and a Leovold. Leovold is a very spooky card. They also have Dig Through Time and Snapcaster. I bought them both the non-lands and draw into a land. I think it was like Snapcaster plus like another Jace or something like that. They play out a Leovold, which is unfortunate because we didn't know about the Mox. They top-decked the Mox. And I wouldn't have tapped out there if... had I known they could cast it on the following turn. Obviously, it's better to Pyroblast Leovold on the stack, but we don't get so lucky. They drew into another one, and we can't counter it, so we have to say, okay. Draw into a Mana Drain, which is kind of savage because, had we had our mana up, this whole game kind of slides on us because they had one of their Moxen that they top-decked, and we didn't play around it. Which I think I played this correctly in the early stages. Unfortunately, we just do not hit on lands. I make another grievous error here. I try to tap my own Tundra, which is already, tapped, to draw a card. I should have done that on their turn. But I was in my head, I'm thinking, all right, I need to make a land drop. I'm so bad. I'm so light on mana right now. If I don't make it, it's catastrophic. But I probably should have waited there until their turn. All right, draw to a Metal Misstep. Not what we want to see. You may say, yes, you have Pyroblast in your graveyard. Right now, I'm waiting on their land so that I can support it with a Flusterstorm, and or do a Dig Through Time on their turn, get it countered, and then Snapcaster with support from Flusterstorm. Not looking good for us, though. We're just getting slowly beat down by a 3/3 as our opponent continues to draw more and more lands. And I'm kind of wondering in my head, I'm like, oh Moto, why did you give him these lands a couple turns ago? But what can you do? Dig Through Time, get countered by Flusterstorm. This is exactly what I expect to happen and I want to happen. Because I'm just light on mana and I need to get their cards down. Find a Force of Will. I just go for it here and figure, hey, if they have Force of Will, they're going to get me. If they don't have Force of Will, then we can possibly win this exchange and turn the game around. They go ahead and cast a Snapcaster of their own because I know they have to cast Snapcaster to get Flusterstorm. It's pretty much Force of Will or bust or another Flusterstorm. They don't. They have the Force of Will, so I just go ahead and pack it in because I'm going to die on the following attack. They'll get this, and then I can block the Snapcaster, puts me down to 1, and if I hit a land, I guess I can play Jace and bounce their guy, but that just seems really, really bad. I guess it was possible. Maybe I should have conceded it. Anyways, quick break, guys. We'll go on to Game 3 against this weird bug Esper list. Guys, back. This hand is perfectly acceptable. Play out a Volcanic Island, Ancestral on their upkeep. They have Metal Misstep. I say, okay, and I go ahead and Force of Will it. They let that resolve, and then they have another Metal Misstep, so they had a 2 Metal Misstep hand, which is rough. They strip mine my land, which is very rough because I'm kind of mana light right now, and I was hoping that Ancestral Recall would help me get a little deeper. I go ahead and shuffle this. I really need more colored mana right now. I draw on a Merchant Scroll, which is not per se great. Opponent plays on a Misty, gets a Volk, ponders. Can't really say anything about that. Draw to a land this turn, which is great. I go ahead and Merchant Scroll. I think this should have been for Gush, actually. I instead get Force of Will because I probably should have gotten Gush, to be honest. That was probably way more correct. Because if I had Gush this turn, I could have possibly... I bought them both, trying to look for more land. If I gotten Gush, I could have made a mana this turn, assuredly, gotten deeper in my deck, and if they countered it, then I could have Ancestral Recalled again. Find a Sapphire. I go ahead and pass it. I kind of want them to have to counter the Snapcaster and or the Ancestral Recall. Upkeep again. Ancestral again. Eats down a counterspell. In this case, a Flusterstorm. Sucks, but it's what happens. And cannot protect it with Force, unfortunately. They go ahead and find a Flooded Strand. I go ahead and just slam a Monastery Mentor here. They go for, I believe, a Lightning Bolt on end step. I go ahead and force it, pitching the Preordain and saving the Snapcaster, which has Preordain, Ponder, and Merchant Scroll as targets right now. Unfortunately, they debated me pretty effectively, and they either draw into it here or they had a Pyroclasm, which is not a card I see very often in Vintage, but it's a card that we definitely had played against us here. We go ahead and attempt to resolve a Snapcaster. It gets Force of Willed, and from here we draw into all mana sources, and our opponent plays a Dak into a Jace and wins the game quite easily. I'm sorry, Leovold first, into Dak, into Jace. I'll go ahead and cut it here because I don't draw anything else interesting, and I can't, really get out of this. Yeah, there's Dak. They steal my artifact. I'm just F6 at this point. Because pretty much you can generally know the game's over once it gets to this point. Like, once they resolve the Leovold and I'm just on duds, on goose eggs, I'm going to lose, and then there you go. That is the game. All right, guys, I'm going to go on a quick break. We'll be back for the concluding game of this series inside. All right, guys, back. Last round opponent. Googles or Goggles? Goggles? Good game, Oggles? I don't know. They mulligan. They have a no-land hand, which I think this hand's going to be good against. It looks like they're on some sort of Angel City Vault or Paradoxical Outcome based deck, which is good for me. That's kind of what I want to face. They preordain here, and I don't opt to counter either of the preordains. I think there's better stuff I can get with my Pyroblast. I go ahead and strip mine their Tolarian Academy, which should significantly reduce their mana production. I believe they go for a Knight's Whisper here. I just go ahead and Flusterstorm this. I figure it's probably worth it. They're not going to probably be running Metal Misstep in their deck because they have too many combo pieces they need to have to make it run. I do, however, keep the Metal Misstep and leave the island on top. My plan is to probably use Merchant Scroll to shuffle away the Jace that's just below that because I don't really need a Jace right now. I don't have enough mana to cast it. And I don't really plan on tapping out against a Storm deck. They play on a Time Vault. I say, yeah, it's fine. Play out the island. Go ahead and find an Ancestral Recall here and say go, leaving up the Pyroblast plus the Metal Misstep. Opponent goes for a Vampiric Tutor. I'm like 90% sure this is probably finding Voltaic Key. I go ahead and Metal Misstep this. They draw either blind into the Force of Will or blind into the blue card. I don't know why they would do that otherwise. Probably blind into blue card. I go ahead and Ancestral Recall myself, draw a bazillion cards, Treasure Cruise, leaving Pyroblast and correction, only Ancestral Recall in the yard. Draw into a Fetch Land plus Stony Silence and end the game on the spot right here. Opponent really can't do anything against this. They've already lost their Tolarian Academy, and they go ahead and try to Brainstorm. I just counter it because I don't want them to make land drops. I just want to keep them under my thumb, play a Jace next turn, and just end the game. So anyways, that is the conclusion. That's the end of Game 1 in this last match set. So quick pause, guys. We'll get to the concluding game here momentarily. Guys, back. This hand is very good because it has the best card in my deck against my opponent. Opponent plays on a Tolarian Academy and Mox Opal. I think they probably have a very fast start, and they could just win on turn 1. But it appears they don't quite have the start that I imagine they possibly could have. I go ahead and get Gitaxian Probe. They have a Flusterstorm as their only means of disruption. I find a Tundra, slam the Ruby, kill my own Ruby, but basically shut off like 95% of their deck. And they go ahead and look for a draw, find nothing of relevance that is worth playing. I draw into a Force of Will, which is pretty good here. I go ahead and just slam a Snapcaster and Gitaxian Probe them. I just want to get deeper in my deck. Right now, my disruptions, Force of Will, and Mental Misstep, and I want to get a clock down and just continue to beat down on them. I'll probably pitch the Lightning Bolt at end step here, but they go ahead and just pack it in, and the game concludes. So, pretty interesting Jeskai blue-white splash red control deck that I stole from the interwebs to play in this Vintage League. Ended up going 4-1 with it, which is not a horrendous result. Lost to kind of like a non-meta deck that ran Leovold, which, Leovold tends to just demolish blue decks. So I don't feel too horrible about losing to that, although we possibly could have kept a little differently in Game 2 and played a little differently in Game 3, a little more carefully. But I was a little aggressive there, and the double Mental Misstep, kind of just owned me. But I'm willing to accept some of that risk. Like, Mental Misstep is not at its all-time high right now, even though I said it's a fine card in the meta. So I don't tend to always just play around it every single time. Sometimes folks are only playing 3 of them. This deck plays 4, may or may not be right. But at the end of the day, the deck had a lot of play to it, and I could generally trace back if I lost a game or if there was a questionable loss in a game. I could trace it back to decision making and kind of see how the deck scales with skill level, which I think it does pretty sharply. In contrast to some other lists that are in the format. Like I definitely played a Mishra's Workshop list, went 3-2 with it, and there were certain games where I just couldn't have played it better. I was just like, well, I was going to lose this game either way. Like I couldn't have played this any better. This deck definitely offers you a lot of play decision, in it. And decks with cantrips, a lot of tutors, fetch lands, tend to let you do that, and counter spells, etc. Plus a ton of draw. But very, very cool deck, very well built deck, and I think very well positioned in the meta right now because I do think it tends to beat the best deck in the format, which I believe to be Paradoxical Outcome, in my personal and humble opinion, through only 5 or 6 run-throughs of the league. But if Vintage is a format you have not tried, I would definitely recommend it. If you're a longer time Magic player, one, it's cheap on MTGO to play, and two, I think it is one of the most skill-intensive formats. There are certainly decks that are not skill-intensive. People will say there's an art to Dredge, and there is. You can play Dredge better and worse, but Dredge is not hard to play. Workshops, you can play it better and worse. I think most of the decision making in that list tends to come in the building process. But I don't think the deck's per se hard to play. I think the deck, will tend to play itself as long as its pilot knows what they're doing. I mean, as far as sequencing goes, do you put lock piece down first? Do you put threat down first? What's the matchup? What is the meta like right now? How do I sequence this hand based on the highest probability of presentation for my opponent? Are they on PO? Are they on Oath? Whatever. Are they on Dredge? So, I do think that you get these big blue decks. These big blue decks are a great starting point in Vintage because I do tend to think they, are fairly powerful decks. And they're fairly decision intensive, so it allows you to get to understand the format because a lot of the misplays you have with them can be very, very punishing, which at least for me, maybe I'm a masochist, tends to teach me the most about the format. But had a pretty good run with it, ended up going 4-1 with it, and great list. I have no complaints about it, and if Vintage is a format that interests you, then I'd recommend you try it out sometime, and this would be a great list, I think, for anyone just starting to get into the format, because I think the list is fairly... It's fairly comprehensive in what it can play against. It has a lot of options. And despite it being a little more focused against Paradoxical Outcome Storm, I think that's just fine because I think that deck is so great. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut it there. We'll be back with more content at some point in time. Maybe Vintage, maybe 100 card, maybe 1v1, who knows. Maybe limited. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I definitely did. So take care now, and see you guys all later.